touch on some of the areas. So I know for decades there have been discussions on how the federal government manages the area around Lake Mead and the area around Gold Butte. And I want to touch on that. And there's a map up here where all of you can come up and see, and there's some additional maps that blow up various parts. But the area in purple is actually the Lake Mead portion of the area that we're talking about. And then there's the darker yellow within the conservation area here. That's some of the proposed areas for wilderness. And then the current designated area for Gold Butte, which doesn't really change within the legislation specifically. So as you may know, there is a proposal now that I hope will bring greater voice to the local community in how the federal land around us is managed. And that's been a big part of what I tried to include in this version of the bill, is to have more local input, to have more local say, working with our local leaders to ensure that you have a voice. Right now, I know there's frustration because we don't have a voice. Some of our local communities don't get enough of a say, and too much gets decided without our input. And I wanted to make sure that this legislation provided that voice for you. Some of the facts about the proposal. This proposal addresses large areas of land that are already being managed by either the National Park Service or the Bureau of Land Management. Okay, so this is not about doing anything that isn't currently being done by those agencies. It's about the level of designation that those agencies have over that land. Let me get through a little bit more of the explanation.
It's untangled a little bit right now. I manage a little of that land myself.
Okay, and let me just go through the proposal, and then we'll hear everybody out. Secondly, this bill in no way has an impact on private land. So we can take your questions, but the legislation does not have any direct impact on private land. The federal government has been controlling and making decisions on how to manage these areas for decades, and we want feedback on how to improve local communities' role in the management of our public lands. So the next slide, the bill that we've introduced creates two local advisory councils. The first is the Virgin Valley Tourism and Economic Advisory Council. A lot of this is about how to promote tourism and economic development so that we can create jobs and spur growth. This council will advise the Department of the Interior on what types of economic development are appropriate for the region and what types are not, so that it's not something that is done to the community, but with direction by the council. The second council is the Gold Butte National Conservation Area Advisory Council. This board will help the federal government develop the management plan for Gold Butte. And again, that's something that we currently do not have. With the conservation that currently exists and the current role that the Park Service plays on the land, we don't really have a say as much as we should. And one of the things that I believe when it comes to public lands in Nevada, since almost 90% of it's controlled by these federal agencies, is that we need more local input. And we have to create legislation to provide for that process, which we currently do not have. Both of these councils that I've talked about will have at least one representative from each of the following communities: Moapa Valley, Mesquite, Bunkerville, the county, and the Moapa Band of Paiutes. Under the legislation as written, each one of those communities will have one representative that will make up these advisory councils so that there is a seat at the table for each of these local communities. Next slide. One thing that I heard in reviewing what had been done previously on this legislation is the fact that, you know, we're really focused on energy development now in Nevada. There's opportunities for new development in the future, and we want to make sure that we know what those development opportunities are and that we don't arbitrarily close off future development in energy, because it creates jobs, it helps our economy, and it helps us as consumers with our energy costs. So my goal with this bill is to give the local community a larger voice in how the public land around them is being managed. And this includes the question of energy development. The bill requires local consultation on energy development. That's in section 103 of the bill. More specifically, it requires the Department of the Interior to sit down with our local community and study what the community really wants regarding any clean energy proposal. And again, that is something that we currently do not have a process for in this area. And you know, reaching out and talking to the commissioner and other local leaders, that's one of the concerns is, you know, are we taking away space that could be appropriate for future development, energy development. And so that's an area that this legislation requires a process, a formal study with a specific time period so that we know if there is potential for energy development, where is the appropriate place for that to go within the larger plan of the conservation area. Next slide. It is true that this bill has language on improving local vote access to Lake Mead. The proposal does not, however, pick local winners or losers. The bill gives the federal government 2 years to implement a plan to improve the local vote access to the lake. The planning for this is to be done with the local advisory council that's created in the bill that I talked about previously. Now, we all know that the levels of the water at the lake have changed due to the drought. And we've seen the facilities at Overton Beach, for example, close. And we know that other communities like Mesquite want increased access to Lake Mead as well. So this legislation directs the federal government to craft a local solution. And I want to be clear about this because I feel like there's been some misleading information that's been put out. It does not say where a boat dock would go. It doesn't say that there would only be one boat dock. It says that the secretary and the department have to work with the local council to determine where is the best access for a boat dock in the area for Lake Mead. And those advisory councils, with the input from the local community, would make those recommendations and the determinations. Next slide.